Let's talk about small swords, baby. Hey folks, Matt Easton here with a small sword. And now, it all started about a year ago. I won some swords in an antique auction. I think maybe it was about a year and a half ago now. And amongst those swords, mostly sabres, obviously, because that's mostly what I buy and sell and collect, was a small sword. And that small sword came to me and I thought, well, this is something I can sell on my website. And I held it and I thought it was a thing of wonder. I had held small swords before, but something within me, deep within me, changed in that moment. Now, I won't say that I'm a small sword lover. I don't want to go that far. I'm not a small sword obsessive. I don't keep, a file of pictures of small swords on my computer or anything like that. But I have learned to appreciate them, I have to say, and this is on a number of levels. Some years ago I made a couple of small sword simulators for fencing purposes that were essentially épée blades with a simplified sort of like a small sword hilt. I didn't use them very much. I used them a little bit and then put them to the side and promptly forgot about them. But when I got an actual antique small sword that I really liked, it was a Colishmud. It wasn't actually this one. This is the one that has replaced it. This is a more fancy one. But Colishmud I've done videos about previously, so broad at the base, thinner after that, and we've talked lots about Colishmud. And I've talked a fair amount about small swords now, it has to be said. But it really kind of like that, having that kind of slightly more substantial small sword and really gaining a liking for it kind of changed how I started to look at the weapon. Now, previously when I've talked about small swords, I won't say that I've necessarily been disparaging of them, but there is definitely in the HEMA community, there are lots of disparaging comments and attitudes towards small swords. Now, fundamentally, why is that? Well, number one, it's a small sword. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, it's the lightest and most dainty of the HEMA weapons you could possibly practice. In literal terms, yes, something like a dagger is actually lighter, or even a single stick is lighter. But the fact that it's for a steel sword is pretty damn light means some people are like, it's a kind of dainty, delicate little weapon, and therefore it is not manly and strong and right. And of course, that's rubbish. It is an incredibly lethal spike, essentially. And small sword fencing itself is, would I say it's less? I would say it is less exerting than things like longsword or sword and buckler or even sabre backsword. Yes, it is. You don't receive as many painful hits. You're less likely, by and large, to sustain an injury, I think, unless you twist your ankle or something like that, or do a hamstring. But it is nevertheless quite athletic. You need to develop a good lunge and recover. It's very fast. You need to be quick and thinking quickly. And I think one of the other reasons why in HEMA circles why people are quite disparaging about small swords is not only because of their physical dimensions, the fact that they're not very long, they're obviously narrow. They predominantly can only thrust. Some of them can cut a little bit maybe, but most small swords are essentially 100% thrust, 0% cut. But the other reason, I think, is because of the similarity to, or perceived similarity to, sport fencing. And yes, absolutely, I might examine this actually in a future video because I think you could probably make a whole video just on that topic. But yes, absolutely, fundamentally, foil fencing is the practice form of small sword fencing. So absolutely, of course, there's similarities between modern sport fencing and small sword fencing. That being said, there's a significant number of differences as well, primarily in the mindset. The fact that if you are training for a duel, for example, then clearly you don't want to be hit by the afterblow. You want to recover to a guard. If we look at Olympic fencing, for example, not so much foil, but particularly if you look at épée or sabre, a lot of it in a martial arts mindset or through a martial arts kind of lens, it would be viewed as suicidal. Because yes, you might stab the person a 25th of a second before they stab you, but you know, what use is that in a martial arts context? None at all. So yeah, absolutely, people in HEMA who are disparaging about sport fencing, and I must say, so I've made some videos which definitely could come across as disparaging about sport fencing, but actually I'm quite pro sport fencing. I am an ex-sport fencer, and you know, I would recommend any kids out there, if you can't get to a HEMA class, go to a sport fencing class. Absolutely, definitely, okay? But without a shadow of a doubt, one of the reasons that the other reason I would say, apart from its size, that Smallsword is disparaged in HEMA is because of its perceived similarity to foil fencing. Not that I think there's anything wrong with foil fencing at all, except for the fact that they don't allow thrusts to the face, which is a historical thing that comes from the fact that they initially weren't wearing fencing masks. And even when they were wearing the early fencing masks, they didn't necessarily trust those to safety. So I think anyway, that's by the by, that's the rules, that's the problem with the rules, not necessarily with the system or the way it's trained. But I have grown in respect for the Smallsword in many ways. And one of those ways that has surprised me is that we have been experimenting. First of all, I should own up. There's been an influx of small swords into my club. It wasn't my fault. It just happened. I don't know, you know, I took my eye off the ball, suddenly there were small swords everywhere. But anyway, they're clearly there to stay now. We've even got a small sword study group being set up by Pedro, no less. That's a good thing. I like doing a bit of small sword fencing. And do you know what? So there's two things I want to mention, reasons why I think HEMA people should have more respect for the small sword. And there are many reasons, but I'm just going to pick on two. Number one, we have been experimenting with small sword versus other swords. And I'll tell you, small sword against rapier, small sword against sabre, small sword against backsword, it's pretty good. It actually really holds its own. And I have to say, in the bouts that I've fought, where I've been using a small sword and my opponent's been using a sabre, I kind of feel like maybe, you know, I had a good measure of it, maybe the best of it in some situations. Now, before I took up the small sword, I had noticed in tournaments in events I'd been at, that very often the small sword has got utterly owned by people with sabres or people with rapiers. But I think I know the answer to that. And the reason is that those small sworders had only trained against other small sworders. And the difference is, in my club, we're not small sworders. We're sabreurs or sword and buckler or long sworders or rapierists or whatever, who have taken up the rapier. And I think that's, taken up the small sword. And I think that puts us in a completely different context, because we know how those other weapons work, and therefore we know their strengths and weaknesses. We pick up a small sword and we go, okay, I can't do this, but I can do this really well. And so we focus on that, knowing what our advantages and disadvantages are against the other weapon we're fighting. So if you're a small sworder and you want to be better against other weapons, practice against other weapons. So that's the first reason why I have a completely expanded respect for the small sword. The second reason is because essentially I think that it really, if you are a sabreur or even a rapierist perhaps, or a backsworder, I think that practicing some small sword, even if you only do it once every now and again, I think it improves your technique. It forces you to improve your lunge and recover. It forces you to focus on a smaller set of things, because you can't cut, so you have to focus on the point work and the feeling of the blade, essentially, the Fühlen for German longsworders, or Lichtenau longsworders. But essentially the portions of the blade and where you bind on your blade relative to the other person's blade become very much more important. Things like the circular parry and the circular disarm underneath, quick beats, a combination of feints that's easier to string together or quicker to string together because it's a lighter, more nimble weapon. So there are certain things that you can really focus on and train better and get better at with a small sword. And because it's so light, I would argue, you can train for longer as well. And incidentally, that was one of the arguments that Italian dueling sabre, or Italian military sabre, some people would argue, Italian sabre, shall we say, treatises argue, is that they use a lighter sabre than the military sabre, or at least they use a lighter sabre, so you can train for longer. And I can see that argument. I don't personally hold with it, because I think it gets you used to using a light sabre, not a lightsaber, a lightsaber. rather than training the military weight saber. And I think your muscles need to get used to handling the weight of the real weapon. But anyway, that's a digression. But coming back to the small sword, so I think those two reasons why it's really good for any HEMA person to practice some small sword is, number one, the small sword is actually pretty good against other sword types, so long as you have the experience of those other sword types and know how to fight against them. And secondly, the fact that focusing on a weapon as specific and specialised as a small sword helps micro train certain things that you don't necessarily train so much when you're doing sabre or side sword or one of these weapons that does more stuff. Last thing I just mentioned, just going back to a point I wanted to mention earlier and forgot to mention as I went past it, remember that when you're fencing small sword, it isn't actually, it is quite like modern foil fencing, but it isn't, for two majorly massive reasons. Or let's make it three majorly massive reasons. Number one, you can move around, okay? You don't only have to move in a straight line. That's the first thing. The second reason why it's very different to foil fencing is we have a full body target, okay? So you can thrust someone in the leg, and you thrust them in the foot, you can thrust them in the face. So it's kind of like épée fencing in that sense. But the third thing that really changes it is that if you come close to someone or get stuck in a bind, you got a hand, and that hand can grab a blade, it can grab a hilt, it can grab a person's body, you can wrestle, and not necessarily the fact that that happens a lot in small sword, although it happens a bit and you can make it happen if you want to. But the fact that you know your opponent can do that to you changes how you fight, because if you look, for example, in épée, in Olympic épée, they'll often charge towards each other, and if two people miss their thrusts, they'll stand there at wrestling range repeatedly trying to get their épée into the other person, and of course they're not allowed to push or punch or knee or wrestle or anything, or disarm, grab the person's weapon, anything like this. So the fact that we are allowed to do that and we can do that changes the nature of the game a lot, and probably means that if you're not as good at grappling as the other person, for the most part you're not going to close on them like that, because it would usually be bad news for you. So there we go. I hope that's some ideas. I'm actually going to just I'm going to wrap things up now, but I'm also going to tag on just a little bit of video of me and Pedro fencing small sword, he's better at small sword than me. But I should point out, we're both novices at small sword, so don't judge us too harshly. Neither of us are Olympic fencers, and neither of us specialise in small sword. We're essentially kind of slightly above beginner level at small sword. But I hope you enjoy it, and see you guys soon. Bye.
Oh, that's good.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.